Hi guys, welcome to Chapter 8, Key Issue 2, although I'm actually going to go over a couple of things that have showed up in a previous unit. And, yeah, so this should be pretty quick. And then there will definitely be a lecture for Key Issue 3 and Key Issue 4 as well. So, we've talked about states, and we've talked about nations, and we've talked about nation states. We haven't talked about colonies in this unit, although we've talked about colonies before. You guys probably remember that they are territories that are legally governed by another state. So colonies do not have sovereignty, is kind of the key. And colonialism usually happens when you get a powerful country like Britain or France or Spain taking over a less powerful country, right? And then the United States got into that too, sort of after World War I. Okay? So colonialism, the colonial era starts in the 1400s. The reason initially Europe was colonizing was to spread Christianity, to get more resources, and if you had a lot of colonies, that meant you had a lot of power because that meant you controlled a lot of the world's resources, okay? So after World War II ends, basically lots of European countries are struggling economically, so they can't afford to keep colonies anymore. So a lot of them are given their independence after that. Britain was probably the most guilty when it comes to the colonizers of the world. All of the pink at one time was a British colony. So the majority of the world at one time was a British colony. That isn't to say not all of this happened at the same time, however. For instance, like we know that they lost control of us at the end of the Revolutionary War, 1783. Australia was not that long after that. This is a little bit later. India was 1945, I believe. So they didn't have all of this territory at the same time, but just at one time, all of this belonged to Britain, which is kind of insane. Okay, and then imperialism is really like more modern colonialism. So that's the colonialism we saw in the 19th and 20th centuries. Things Fall Apart would be a book that's more about imperialism than it is colonialism. And speaking of things fall apart, most of the imperialism that occurred at that time was in Africa. So we often call this time period the scramble for Africa as well. And this is kind of what we mean by that. All of these areas in Africa were controlled by an outside nation. Okay, so you can see, really, Ethiopia was one of the, and Liberia are the only areas that were independent and not controlled by Britain or Germany or France or Belgium or some other country, right? So it wasn't a country at the time, but Kenya would be along here somewhere. So they were probably the Belgian Congo is probably where Rwanda would be. Okay. And then that just shows you a global perspective of what colonial holdings existed. Okay, so what's important for our purposes in this unit is what happens after imperialism ends, okay? So most African and Asian countries become independent after World War II, but there were still some colonies for a little bit longer. But what's really important is after that happens, countries are basically left to fend for themselves. And if you aren't used to being in charge of your own government and making your own laws, it's really hard to learn those things really quickly and to get your country back on track. So I often think about different revolutions in history and how the American Revolution was pretty clean in that we won and then we established a democracy and went on our merry way. That almost never happens when it comes to revolutions and when it comes to countries gaining their independence. It's usually a total disaster, unfortunately, because democracy is hard. especially when you're used to living under some sort of dictator or monarchy, right? Okay, we talked about all this stuff, so I'm just going to skip through. I talked about this stuff today, and this, and this. Okay, so we talked a little bit about multinational states today. I've given you the United Kingdom as an example. If we consider the United Kingdom a state, within it is Northern Ireland, Wales, Scotland. Those are all separate nations, although I don't know that I'd really call them nations. So it's the same kind of idea. I gave you Israel as an example. You have Israelis and you have Palestinians, two very, very different nations. And Israel, we would almost call that like the Jewish nation as well. So they are living within the same borders, but are two very separate nations. So that is often a problem. So multinational states are often not very stable, and they often breed conflict. Part of this comes with ethno-nationalism, which is a strong feeling of belonging to a minority nation that is contained within a state dominated by a more powerful nation. Really complicated definition, but it's actually not that hard. So the Palestinians are not necessarily the minority by population, but I think what we mean to say is that Israel is the more powerful of the two groups. Okay? So, So because Israel is more powerful, there's a lot of resentment on behalf of the Palestinians, and so that kind of can turn into an ethno-nationalist situation where the Palestinians really want their own territory and want their own land. And since Israel was created after Palestine, I think Palestinians would probably argue that they want their land back. So they want the Israelis out. Okay? So when that happens, it can also lead to separatism, which is sort of what's happening in Catalonia right now when we talked about languages in Chapter 5. Catalonia wants to separate from Spain and become their own country. That's called separatism, okay? It can also lead to secession, which is the act of breaking away from an existing country. So like the South during the Civil War in the United States seceded, okay? And we could call that movement really a separatist movement, the Civil War. And these are often not conflicts that are solved via treaties or negotiations or diplomacy of any kind. Usually they are carried out with wars and violence. Okay. Another concept we need to talk about is irredentism, which is a difficult one to say, and I always say it wrong. That's when a nation's homeland spills into another state, and the people of the wrong side of the boundary wish to join their territory with the rest of their homeland. So, basically, this hopefully is review for some of you. If you remember, one of the migrations we talked about in Chapter 3 was between India and Pakistan. So, 1945, Britain leaves and separates Pakistan and India. India is the Hindu population. Pakistan is the Muslim population. Problem is, not all Muslims lived in the Pakistani area, and not all Hindus lived in the Indian area. So that desire to want to be with your people when you're on the wrong side of the boundary, that's called irredentism. So here's a good example.
India and Pakistan are currently involved in open skirmishes along their mutual border. India's Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, is also accusing Pakistan of engaging in a proxy war against India through terrorism. The question is, what started all of this fighting, and will we ever see an end to this conflict? Well, a lot of the current fighting is over disputed land, but the ill will and hostilities date back to the origins of both nations. For hundreds of years, the Indian subcontinent was controlled by the British, until 1947, when the British left and divided up the country. India was established as a secular nation with a primarily Hindi and Sikh population. Pakistan was established as an Islamic nation with a primarily Muslim population. Soon after the divide, there was an enormous migration of an estimated 14 million people. These were Muslims trying to move from India to Pakistan, and Hindus and Sikhs trying to move from Pakistan to India. It remains one of the largest population exchanges in history, but it was also a human rights disaster, with violence breaking out on both sides of the border. It's reported that nearly 1 million people died in the fighting, and at least 75,000 women were abducted. The extent of that atrocity cannot be overstated. Mass killings, rapes, and mutilations by both sides were not uncommon. That is the starting point for this current conflict, but it's not the central cause of the fighting. The dispute is now largely about land and resources. When the British left the subcontinent, they designated land for both India and Pakistan, but other areas like Kashmir, which was a princely state under the British, were left undecided. Britain let those regions decide their own fate. Did they want to join India, join Pakistan, or become their own independent nation? Unfortunately, the people of Kashmir never fully got their chance to decide because in 1947, both India and Pakistan invaded, each laying claim to a portion of the region. Since then, 3 wars and countless skirmishes have been fought over Kashmir. India also sided against Pakistan in Bangladesh's war for liberation, which resulted in eastern Pakistan becoming Bangladesh. And to top it all off, India and Pakistan are economic rivals that have a large amount of shared or disputed resources, namely water and oil. So dramatic showdowns over those issues are also possibilities. If you'd like to check out our World at War playlist, click here now. And remember, we upload new videos 5 days a week, so please subscribe. In 1998, the...
Okay, so, let me just put this up. Okay, so, especially the people who were living in Kashmir experience irredentism. So, that's still an ongoing issue. Both India and Pakistan claim Kashmir, so that would also be a good example of a disputed region, and this is an ongoing conflict. So, yep, okay. So I just wanted to re-emphasize that a lot of these conflicts, like India, and lots of conflicts in Africa, like the Rwandan genocide, are left over from colonialism and imperialism. So again, it's that rapid, disimperialism isn't a word, but that's kind of what I'm talking about. So when really suddenly all of these colonies got their independence and didn't know what to do with it, a lot of these problems happened, okay? Especially when borders were drawn like that arbitrarily, like, okay, Muslims, you go up here, Hindus, you go down here, without any regard for where people were living at the time, leads to a lot of these different problems, okay? So, look up for Chapter 8, Key Issue 3 next time you are on the website. And that's about it. And be ready for a pop quiz, of course, as always.